As my guest David explains, there's a variety of reasons why we might want regulations for AI. So think about social media and the way in which information gets spread on it, and in particular, disinformation or misinformation gets spread with the potential of undermining democratic elections. Of course, we've always shared information with each other. Of course, there's always been lying around elections, but there's something about the scale and severity of the impact that social media allows us to accomplish that makes us think maybe this ought to be regulated. In particular, we have AI algorithms creating, designing, manipulating people's news feeds and having the kind of impacts that we're worried about. So one reason why we might want regulations for AI or particular applications of AI is that it takes things that we've already done and sort of puts them on steroids in a way that makes it way more dangerous than it was before. Another is just that there are various kinds of applications of AI that we might just think, we haven't done that kind of thing before, or we haven't done it in a while, but we might do it now and we really ought not to. It'd really be a disaster. So we've always engaged in some level of surveillance, government surveillance, corporate surveillance, but AI allows us to, again, really turn the volume up on that kind of thing. There's also the ability to use software, AI-enabled software, to at least allegedly recognize people's emotions on their faces and make certain inferences about how they ought to be treated based on that. You might use certain kinds of biometric information of people to make inferences about the likelihood that they'll commit a crime. And you might think, I think, we just shouldn't allow that sort of stuff. That stuff is too scientifically unproven. It's outright just nonsense science. It's too ethically problematic to be allowed. Take one more example. Take self-driving cars. You might think, yeah, we've had driving around for a while, but probably there should be some kinds of regulations about what constitutes safe enough to deploy in a given context. So we need, it seems anyway, laws, regulations to protect people from the various things that we can do with AI. The most popular regulation, there's a bunch in play right now, but the most popular one is the EU AI Act. And the reason that it's so popular, it gets a lot of attention, is that it's been in the works for many years, and it is on the cusp of passing. It's March 4th, 2024, as I say these words, and the act should pass in probably about a month, give or take. The act does prohibit certain kinds of applications of AI, for instance, using biometric information to infer the likelihood that someone's going to commit a crime. That kind of thing is not allowed. There's another category within the act that's not prohibited, but it's high-risk AI. Now, high-risk AI is a really interesting category because it's not that the companies that if they engage in certain kinds of practices, they're doing something illegal. It's that they have to exercise extra care in the design and deployment of AI. They have to sort of put on extra layers of due diligence. They have to record what they do, the decisions that they make, and they have to be transparent with regulators about the kinds of decisions that they made. This, by the way, strikes me as a bit odd. There's an empirical claim here that even though some act might not be illegal, nonetheless, if the companies are required to record the substantive decisions that they make, such that something unethical is done, but it's not illegal, then the companies will likely not do it. I'm dubious about that. I'm skeptical that this is going to sufficiently persuade companies to not do the unethical thing, at least in many cases. My guest, though, David, is more optimistic. He thinks that the act of writing these kinds of things down and having to be transparent will, in fact, curb unethical behavior. And probably, he's right to some extent, I think. The question is, will it curb enough of that unethical behavior? Will it curb those really severe unethical behaviors? And I'm just not sure. So that's one of the focal points of our discussion that I think is worth highlighting. We talk about a lot of other things. We talk quite a bit about social media. We talk a little bit about open source AI. So that's AI that is in the hands of everyone as opposed to being in the hands of, say, a private corporation. A lot of people think having open source AI is a really great thing because it democratizes AI. David and I are actually on the same page here, I think, where we think it's rather dangerous to put this phenomenally powerful technology in the hands of lots of people. But anyway, we discuss all those things and more, all things AI and regulation and law. Okay, as usual, please review the podcast. Share it with your friends. Email me at em@reedblackman.com if there's anyone you want me to talk to or some issue you want me to address. And with that, let's go talk to David. So, David, you're a proponent for regulating AI. What do you think of as the biggest reason or the biggest reasons for why we need any kind of regulation?
Well, the good news is there actually already is some regulation that applies to AI. A lot of it was written before what we call AI was AI, but that's civil rights laws, Civil Rights Act in the United States, and many other similar laws in different parts of the world require that we not discriminate against people on the basis of their race or their gender or other protected classes. And companies, including my former employer, Meta, have already been sued under civil rights laws for AI-facilitated discrimination. And that includes a lawsuit from the Department of Housing and Urban Development in the United States suing Meta for facilitating housing discrimination through its AI-based ads targeting products.
We know that bias in AI is a big thing, and I don't know. The question is, do we really need a regulation? And so far, it sounds like not so far, because we've already got anti-discrimination law on the books. So what do we need that's additional to that?
Yeah, so in addition to that, there are a bunch of new types of harms that AI can cause that are not covered by that. And some of these are actually areas where some parts of the world, the European Union, for example, actually does have some laws that have already taken effect, but the United States and many other parts of the world don't. And that's around something called ranking and recommendation systems. And that's not the generative AI that the world woke up to last year, but that's the AI behind social media newsfeed ranking. And those ranking and recommendation systems have been demonstrated to cause heightened distribution of extreme content, sometimes are responsible for misinformation and the spread of influence campaigns designed to change how people think, designed to change the outcome of elections. And the EU has a law called the Digital Services Act, which is starting to regulate those, just came into effect a couple months ago. The EU also, alongside that act, created a new body based in Spain called the European Center for Algorithmic Transparency. And I think that is really important. And it requires the very large online platforms like your Facebooks, Twitters, TikToks of the world, and also search engines too, to do really detailed risk assessment, make risk mitigation plans, and then get independent audits and even give independent researchers from universities access to their systems. That's all just happening in Europe, though. And so in the US, we're in the dark on.
So wait, before we get to where we are in Europe and the US, so the thought is that there's certain AI algorithms at play behind social media, and that's what explains extreme content and misinformation. Do I have that right? And the position is something like, we need regulations to disallow such things. Is that the thought?
I wouldn't say that it explains misinformation. Most of the time, people, but now increasingly AI, may be responsible for creating
the scale of the spread.
Exactly. The scale of the spread can be really heightened by algorithms or AI ranking and recommendation systems that look for and rank based on engagement. They look for pieces of content that people will maybe love or maybe hate, and they spread that kind of content because it keeps people clicking, keeps people on social media platforms.
So suppose I say something like, yeah, I don't like extreme content or whatever that amounts to. I don't like social media companies feeding us the stuff that we keep clicking on to keep people on the site, quote unquote, addicted, whatever that amounts to. It's gross. You might even think it's ethically shitty. But not all ethically shitty things should be regulated against. Lying to your best friend, cheating on your spouse, those are ethically shitty things that I don't want the government to say, hey, if you lie to your best friend, there's going to be a fine for that or something along those lines. That would be too great an impingement on autonomy, something along those lines. So it can't be the case that just because it's sort of ethically bad or ethically gross or something along those lines that it ought to be regulated. So what makes it the case, in your view, that this rises to a level that it really ought to be regulated against?
That's a great question. And there's some nuances that I find really interesting in the way that the European Union chose to put the Digital Services Act in place. And one really interesting finer point of this law is that it doesn't change or expand the definition of illegal speech. And when you think about illegal speech, Europe doesn't have a First Amendment like we do, but they've got similar rights to freedom of expression. Illegal speech would be something like promoting terrorism or recruiting terrorists or CSAM, which stands for child sexual abuse
Sure.
material, those are illegal, both in Europe and in
Yep.
the United States. So
Yep.
Digital Services Act doesn't change that. What it does is it requires these platforms to take a strong, hard look at the risks that their systems may be creating for the world, describe those in a transparent way to the world, and then tell the world what they're doing to address those risks and then get audited about it. At no point does the law say, now misinformation of all types is illegal. Doesn't change the definition of misinformation. But what it does is it helps people like me and probably like you who are really concerned about the future of democracy and the way that social media might be affecting our mental health and the way it affects children and children's lives. It forces the companies to tell us what's going on inside of those systems that before this law were really opaque. And I think we will only begin now that the world, at least in Europe, is starting to have this access, begin to better understand this because we'll have such better visibility and also requirements that the companies continue to keep updating their assessments.
So I guess the idea then is, look, nothing new is illegal in terms of what you can or cannot say, something along those lines.
Yep.
And that said, when people say X, where X is some illegal thing to be said, as you said, CSAM or recruiting terrorists, something along those lines, when they say it on social media is in some sense or other complicit. And so something like the DSA or other similar kinds of regulations that either exist elsewhere or may exist in the future, the idea is to hold them responsible to some extent for the kinds of things that are said on their platforms.
Yeah, it is. And often, though, I think it's important to note that that is based on the platforms, either individually or even as a group. The platforms do collaborate to set in working groups different ideas about best practices around these issues, around mis and disinformation. So in some ways, the platforms, what the European Union describes it as is sometimes as a regulatory dialogue. So it's not so much about creating new hard and fast rules. The regulators there are smart and they know that the technology is constantly changing, but it's about creating a dialogue between regulators and the companies building the technology about how to build technology that benefits society.
Yeah. I mean, I always hate that phrase, technology that benefits society. I mean, society's not this monolith. Society as a whole does well. I mean, some groups are going to do really well. Some people are going to do really poorly. And sometimes one group doing really well comes at the expense of another group doing really poorly. And that's fine. Good for society always strikes me as just too grand, no?
I think that's fair. I think it's valuable to be more explicit. I think maybe drilling down one notch, I would say these regulations force the companies or push the companies towards producing technologies that are evaluated not just based on the amount of revenue that they generate for each company. And most of these companies are publicly traded. And so they have pretty significant responsibility to keep growing their profits, growing their revenue every quarter. And by instituting regulations, it sets some rules of the road, some rules that they all can, in some places, agree on, because sometimes the companies all come to the table to agree on these best practices. Sometimes the regulators set the rules, but then it avoids this race to the bottom dynamic where the companies know that they are beholden to maximizing profit for their shareholders. And therefore, even if they would like to prioritize the well-being of the people who use their products, they in some ways structurally can't do that because their competitors will eat their lunches and their users might leave.
Yeah. I mean, one last point about social media, and then we can move on to other kinds of, in your view, why regulations are needed. Suppose I said this. This is to some extent me playing devil's advocate, but why not? So why not view social media companies as akin to hardware stores in the following sense? You go to the hardware store, you write whatever you want on that poster, and then you put that poster board up or you put it on a wood stick, whatever, then you go in your protest line. You buy markers at the hardware store and all the materials so that you can, as well as you can, blast out your message, albeit in the sort of literal town square. Why not view a social media platform as akin to a hardware store? And just like we don't have regulations around hardware stores because hardware stores enable the spreading of, vile content or something like that, or even misinformation, why hold social media companies any more responsible? Or why should it be any different?
I wouldn't go so far as to say we don't have any regulations on hardware stores, firstly. I mean, the last time I bought a chainsaw, there sure was a lot of legal text and warnings and things about how to use that product, right? And those, I don't think a 10-year-old can go in and buy a chainsaw.
Yeah, but stick with poster board. Stick with poster board, the wooden thing that you attach the poster board to, and the markers.
Yeah, absolutely.
I can go with a stationery store instead if you prefer.
Okay, we'll go for stationery store. So the social media platforms have come to play such an important role in our society that tiny little changes to their AI systems, their recommendation systems, can have enormous effects on people. They can cause people to have eating disorders. They can cause people to have mental health issues because of how they're using them. They can have really detrimental effects on children's self-esteem. Yeah. And they can also turn elections. That, it's something that we have not until today been able to document that well because of the opacity of what happens on these platforms. But these are, they're not like stationary stores. They're more like public utilities. They are things that so many of us use, and that also it's difficult to have a lot of competition on because of the network effects. It's hard to migrate a whole group of people from one social media platform to another, just because of the switching costs are so high. And therefore, I believe strongly, and I think a lot of other people do, that rather than saying, let's just have a free-for-all and we'll keep switching platforms when one doesn't do what we want and the market will solve it, we should think like, oh, actually, this is critical infrastructure. This is really important to our society. And so let's put some rules on it so that we don't have to keep switching platforms when a billionaire decides to turn them into toxic places.
Yeah, I mean, you have in one respect and not another. I'm on board with half of what you said, not the other half. The half I'm on board with, I'll start with the half I'm not on board with. Not yet anyway. Maybe you could convince me. I'm not on board with it's being a public utility. The internet, public utility, absolutely. Social media, I don't know, sort of less convinced of that. Facebook, is that a social utility? Plenty of people get along just fine. It doesn't seem to be, if anything, not having Facebook in my life is the absence of a deprivation. It's it's almost the presence of a good in my life that it's not there, something along those lines. So I'm not sure it rises to the level of trains and water and stuff along those lines. But the part that I am on board with what you said earlier is something like the kinds of impacts that it can have are so great and so severe in the negative sense. Mass depression among teenage girls, undermining of the electoral process, etc. I think it's the scope and the severity of the damage that's possible with social media that makes it the case that government intervention is appropriate.
I think that's absolutely fair. I agree there are differences between public utility, but one thing I see a lot, like when people leave Facebook for a long time, and I've done that too, is they'll come back around major life events. A lot of people came back at the beginning of COVID because we were stuck inside and we were really lonely. Sure. People also come back to post an obituary when a family member dies, or they come back to announce a new baby or a marriage. And people really value being able to have a space where they can do that, where they can share these experiences. And I think that's, it's so valuable to us that I see reasons to think of it as something that, as a society, we should have some say in how it functions.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on from social media. So I get that you think that there are certain kinds of AI that we need regulation around AI, in particular in the social media space for the reasons articulated. Are there other kinds of regulations that you think we need for AI? Not social media related?
Absolutely there are. So the next level of AI harms, and I say harms because a lot of people think about regulation as needing to come from a demonstrated harm. And there are a set of them that really start to emerge with more advanced AI systems. And, one obvious area is self-driving cars. And that has some regulations in certain jurisdictions already. But I think that's one that we can all agree on. And it flows from, a century plus of regulation on automobiles. But I think that's a pretty obvious one that we need safety standards on. Another, a really big law that is in the final months before it's probably going to pass is the European Union's AI Act. And this is a pretty huge leap forward if it does pass. The EU AI Act sets up this interesting structure of different levels of risk for different applications of AI. And so you have what are called the prohibited uses of AI. And those are things like police surveillance. They're still figuring out. There may be some exemptions on that, but
probably military exemptions as well.
Exactly. National security exemptions. But to a certain degree, that kind of pervasive, always on surveillance of everyone, that's going to be prohibited. Then there are also prohibitions on what's called emotion recognition tools in workplaces and in schools. Those could be designed to be, I think, really bad bosses that you don't want micromanaging your emotions.
Yeah. Recognition software always struck me as such total bullshit. It's like, at best, it accurately identifies an emotion you are feeling. But it could miss a bunch of other ones. It wouldn't identify why you're experiencing that emotion. It wouldn't articulate or discover what your attitude is towards you or having that emotion. It just seems, it could think that you're happy about X because X was just talked about, but really in the person's head, they're thinking about Y. And so their face is reflecting what they're thinking about, which is not what the conversation is about. Anyway, so just that seems like probably a good ban on the basis of it's really shitty science.
Yes, absolutely. And when it underperforms, it probably underperforms in a biased way. It may
that's the second issue.
Work better on white faces versus black faces. And that's something that this amazing
or
author...
people who can move their faces, as opposed to people who have some sort of disease where they can't actually activate all the muscles in their face. And so half their face is frozen and now they get misread and, things go sideways, say, for a so-called job interview with an AI.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a great book on this by Joy Buolamwini called Unmasking AI, and she talks about all the challenges specifically around facial recognition. So facial recognition was a big topic in the EU AI Act, and that's in part because they started working on the EU AI Act back in 2019. It came a long way before generative AI. So one of the other things that's banned is what they call untargeted scraping of facial images from the internet or CCTV footage. And that's something that a number of companies have actually done that and marketed products to law enforcement or to be used in identifying people. So that's out. Then social scoring is something that you might have heard of in China, where people get something like a credit score, but it's much broader for all aspects of your interactions in society, totally banned. And then biometric categorization. This is another frightening one where AI systems would use your skin tone or your facial structure or other things that they get from images or data around you to make inferences about gender, sexual orientation, or even your likelihood of committing a crime. And that, to me, that one, that sounds so full of problems. And then one of the last ones I want to highlight that's been banned is predictive policing. And not all forms of it, but some forms of it. And, predictive policing is saying, like, we should stop this person because we think they might have committed a crime. And you can also talk about it in terms of criminal justice and sentencing, which has also been problematic.
So, I guess one thing that when I asked originally, do we really need regulations for AI? You said yes, social media. And, that's a particular use case for AI, right? It's if you're using AI for social media, there needs to be certain kinds of constraints. Then, we're talking about, you talked about emotion recognition software. Well, a variety of use cases for AI that are banned or potentially banned by the EU AI Act, if it should come to pass, the European Union Artificial Intelligence Act.
Yep.
But this sort of feels to me like regulatory whack-a-mole or something along those lines. Let's try to think of the set of all potential use cases that we would think should be banned, should be unacceptable. But the odds are there's going to be some use cases that we haven't thought of yet, perhaps because the technology is not there yet, but it will be 6 months after the act passes, a year after the act passes, 4 years after the act passes, whatever it is. And so it just seems kind of, I don't know, impossible in some sense to effectively regulate this when So far, what you've talked about are very use case specific bans. But is it just a game of regulatory whack-a-mole? I mean, is there another alternative? Is there an alternative to a game of whack-a-mole? Is that what we're supposed to do? Just keep guessing? And the other thing is, there might be some things that we think, first, there are false positives, right? Things that we think would be really dangerous. And it turns out it wouldn't be dangerous. We don't need a governmental ban. The science is bad. There wouldn't be uptake in the market. Those businesses would go out of business. And then there's going to be false negatives where we think, oh, that's either one, we just don't think of the thing. We don't think of the use case. And then it pops up. Or we think of the use case and we think, that won't be so bad. That's not a big deal. But then it turns out to actually have these knock-on effects that we didn't realize, and it's actually really bad and should have been regulated against in some fashion, but we didn't do it. And so it just sort of seems to me, it feels like guesswork.
Yeah, so it's a fair point. And, when I worked at Facebook, I worked on a couple of teams. One was called the Civic Integrity Team, where we tried to address threats to elections on social media. And another was called the Responsible AI Team. And whack-a-mole was brought up frequently, like, it's so frustrating. It's just whack-a-mole. But, that's part of society. That's part of government. I mean, imagine if you're a police officer, you go to work every day. It's just whack-a-mole. Someone else committed a crime. You're a fireman or firefighter. You go to work every day. There's another fire. It's just whack-a-mole with fires in this town. Well, yeah, that's what it takes to maintain a society, is to be constantly putting scrutiny on this stuff.
Well, I'm sorry. That analogy doesn't strike me as totally apt. I mean, it's a game of whack-a-mole in, let's say, executing the law or executing your responsibilities. Like the way in which you're going to discharge your responsibility as a firefighter or as a police officer or whatever, they're going to be different depending on, what day it is and which house is on fire and, how many people are in the building, et cetera, et cetera. I guess I don't think of laws, and maybe this is just sort of my naivete or ignorance or both about how law is made. Primarily think of it as just a game of whack-a-mole. Especially sort of forward-guessing whack-a-mole. Like, how might people do this? I can see, okay, we've got all these car crashes, and people are flying through the windshields. We need to require seatbelts. I don't know that I see that yet with AI. It seems to be more predictive. And then I'm, to quote someone else who was on this podcast a little while back, we're bad at predictions. We're bad at predicting how the world's going to unfold.
Yeah, I think that's fair. But so maybe we can agree to disagree on the whack-a-mole thing. But I think I need to highlight that the EU AI Act also foresees this issue, that it is a constantly changing technology. And so they actually, in the press conference they did a couple of weeks ago in announcing that they'd come to this provisional agreement on the act, is they talked about what they are doing to make the EU AI Act future-proof. And future-proofing, they've created a new office called the AI Office in the European Union. There will also be equivalent offices, or responsible offices, might be existing offices in each country. And then there will also be an advisory body composed of representatives from academia, civil society, industry, that will have the ability to meet on a continuing basis to update the laws and the rules. And they have a couple different legal mechanisms to continue to update. And some of those include standards bodies that will continue to update technical definitions, and also will continue to update the types of AI uses that fall into these different categories.
So those models that pose systemic risk, plus certain kinds of AI applications that get classified as high risk by the Act, by the AI Act, these require extra scrutiny or something like that. You got to do more stuff, right? So let me ask you though, I mean, do we have reason to think that whatever that new stuff is will actually mitigate risks? I mean, if there aren't new laws, I get, the prohibited stuff, but if we're not talking about making additional things illegal, then what does it matter? So they say, we documented what we did this time. Whatever the requirements of the act are, whatever that quote unquote extra scrutiny looks like, do we have any reason to think that those things will actually mitigate risk? Or will it just be things that, the company checks these boxes, these compliance boxes, and then they're like, we did the things, but, we're releasing the same model we would have otherwise because nothing new was illegal by virtue of the act. So what does it matter to us?
The things worth mentioning is that I think it's more than just some symbolic stuff. Like, the general purpose systems are going to have the ones that cross the line and become systemic risk are going to have to be a lot more transparent about for instance, what material was used to train those models. And that means a lot to people in the news, journalism, media, entertainment industries, because just transparency on that opens up to the possibility of people trying to sue or, continuing to sue, I should say, the companies that are training these systems based on copyrighted materials. They also are requiring that before these models are launched publicly, that the companies releasing them conduct what some people call red teaming, and EU is calling model evaluations to assess these risks. Or they're also using the term adversarial testing. And that's quite important because, there's a big debate about this right now about whether or not advanced AI systems are going to be able to design the next coronavirus or design novel bioweapons, chemical weapons. And the only way to figure that out, and people including Sam Altman, have admitted that they often don't know what these AI systems are going to be able to do. They don't know what their capabilities are until they're trained. And so putting that requirement that they have to be adversarially tested, which includes, I'm assuming, haven't seen the final text, but I assume that means by external parties, third parties. I think that is really huge. And again, it's similar language to the Digital Services Act. They have to assess and mitigate the risks of their AI systems. Then there are reporting.
Sorry, but do they have to mitigate ethical risks that are not also legal risks? So they find some ethical risks that are not. It causes, aggression in teenage boys, right? Analogous to the depression in teenage girls. Like that. It causes increased aggression among teenage boys. That's not illegal, as far as I know. It's not regulated against to cause increased aggression. If so, then they'd probably ban MMA or whatever. So suppose they say, yeah, we did this red teaming. We found that it causes increased aggression among teenage boys, but it also gets them really engaged with our platform, whatever it is. So, and it's not illegal, so there's no legal risk to mitigate, so off we go. Do they need to do anything more now?
So absolutely, that's a great point. And I think, I talked to someone who worked at one of these companies that develops these AI systems, and they told me that they think that this risk assessment and mitigation framework is just absolutely brilliant because while it doesn't make new stuff illegal, it forces the companies to write down all the bad things that their products could cause. And just the act of writing that down and then saying publicly what they've done to stop those things, and then bringing in an auditor probably to assess if they really did everything they could have done, really changes the position of that company when those harms come to pass. And if they do come to pass, it puts them in a situation of, wow, you mean you released this product and my child committed suicide and you knew that the product could pose an increased risk of suicide? Yeah. That sets the companies up for huge brand disasters, catastrophes.
Right. So in other words, what you're saying is something like, look, by forcing them to investigate and B, write these things down, they'll be more sensitive to their reputational risk. Their reputational risk will also increase. So they'll have to be sensitive to an increased reputational risk. That's plausible. I think that for a lot of these companies, they're like, I've heard from, your old company, people at Meta who are they've gotten to the point where just like, fuck it. If we do X, the journalists kill us for this. If we do not X, they kill us for a different thing. So no matter what we do, we're going to get dragged through the mud by the journalists. So forget it. We're just ignoring all this stuff now.
I'm guessing that person didn't work in PR because last I checked, they still have a communications team and they're still actively trying to improve the brand of the company.
Yes, but the person that I was talking to was a sort of, more on the data science-y teams.
Yeah,
or they were. Yeah.
Yeah. It's fair. Sometimes you look at, the big tech companies and you think they're just, running roughshod over, any kind of standards and ideas about this. But I think there's some companies that are taking a position of building their brand on being leaders in ethics and doing the work in the most ethical way.
Yeah. I'm not saying it's not plausible. It's sort of an empirical claim. It's an empirical claim about the extent to which data science teams, chief information officers, chief data officers, the kinds of people who oversee the building, the designing and deploying of AI in their organizations, It's going to depend upon how sensitive those people are to the reputational risk of the organization. And while the PR people might be really sensitive, those PR people don't talk to the C-suite on the tech side of the house. So I guess I just don't know. It's an empirical claim that these companies will really care, that, say, the non-tech side of the house, let's say the CEO, is going to really say to the tech side of the house, hey, be careful with our reputation. And then the other thing is that I think that a lot of technologists say like, yeah, we got it. And then they don't have it because they don't understand really the scope and the kinds of the risks, because they're math people who are great at one thing, but they're not great at, say, identifying ethical and reputational risks in a product that their model will be a part of, because that's just not their thing. So again, I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm not even saying it's improbable. I guess I'm just saying I don't know. It's an empirical claim about the extent to which those teams will actually be concerned about those kinds of reputational risks.
Yeah, well, I think this is a really interesting thing about that question, is that it changes depending on the state of the economy. So I worked at Facebook from 2018 to until the beginning of this year. And I joined right as Cambridge Analytica was blowing up as an enormous scandal in the press. And the company, from CEO on down, was definitively certain, especially after, a month of stock dropping, bad PR after bad PR, and so much bad public opinion. The company became very determined to not ever let that happen again, and invested a lot of money in building new teams on that. And then the same thing happened around Russian hacking of the 2016 US presidential election. And billions and billions of dollars were spent on making sure that didn't happen again. Also, $5 billion were spent on paying the FTC a fine for what happened there.
I agree that if there's a particular thing where the shit hit the fan, the company will put money into making sure that the shit doesn't hit the fan in exactly that way again. But, Meta, Facebook owned Instagram, to take your earlier example. They knew it causes depression or anxiety, or both, among teenage girls. They decided to ignore it, and that happened after the Cambridge Analytica scandal. So their concern for ethical uprightness didn't spread from Cambridge Analytica type scandals to other kinds of potential scandals. It seems, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes companies don't learn, or they don't take lessons that they learn in one domain and apply them to others. And, Facebook is not the only company that's paid billions of dollars in fines and had these giant scandals. And absolutely, they keep making mistakes. And I think, what some regulators are trying to do is set up systems that don't force society to get dragged through the mud in those risks. Like, when you think about the risks, there's a PR risk to the company, but there's a much greater, almost, unquantifiable risk to us, to society, that, that the companies choose to take on, that we don't, without regulation, have a say in.
Yeah. I want to address one last issue. I want to talk about open source AI. I know that you've written about this sort of thing. First, can you just say a little bit about what open source is in general, or what open source AI in particular is, and what we're supposed to think about it from a regulatory perspective?
Yeah, great question. So open source is a term that is used to describe software, technology. Sometimes it's even applied to other types of content like writing or music or video. When it's made, the underlying source code, or in some cases the legal rights to use that source code or to use that content are open or made available to people.
Just give me an example of someone who might use open source software in some, I don't know, maybe it's a corporate context, maybe it's not.
Well, the Android operating system is, the most famous one. If you're on a Mac, there are open source elements of that operating system. And, another one is Wikipedia, that everyone knows about Wikipedia. So Wikipedia is both the underlying software that is used to make it, but also the text that people write and contribute is what people would call open source. Now, in the AI space, the definition of open source is not exactly the right term for what I have written about, that I am concerned about. So the thing I'm concerned about is what some people would call these advanced persistent threat actors. And these are, people, sometimes even a whole office building, like the Russian Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, which was reportedly about 1,000 people that would come to work every day just to produce fake content to damage and tear apart American democracy. So those people, once an AI system is opened up, once the weights are available, they can use that to target us and to harm us.
Yeah. Before people were talking about, maybe at the same time, people were talking about open source AI, or maybe it was of a piece. Lots of people were talking about democratizing AI. And I always thought, by which that meant, let's get AI in the hands of as many people as possible. And I always thought, what? That just seems obviously stupid. You can't say on the one hand, this is the most powerful technology we've ever had, or at least in many respects. It's not nuclear weapons, but it's some of the most powerful technology that's out there. And we're going to give it, we know that there are these associated risks with that technology, and we're going to give it to everyone, every idiot who wants to access it, let alone people with evil intentions, bad intentions. We're just going to give it to everyone. That just strikes me as obviously insane. And yet, because people love, I don't know if it's because democratization sounds like democracy, and so it must be good, or it's power to the people, but there just seems to be this unthinking affirmation of the democratization of AI, and I just think that's insane. So my natural thought would be, don't we want to regulate OpenAI even, I don't know, in some sense more than regular AI or something like that? We want to really keep an eye out for it, since anyone can build dangerous OpenAI and then anyone can get their hands on it. It seems like an obvious target for regulation.
Well, the answer is yes, yes, and yes. And also just a clarification. When people say OpenAI, it's the name of a company. People sometimes say OpenAI to talk about open source AI. I think you were talking about open source in general.
Yeah, but if I missed the word source, that's what I meant to pop in there. Yeah.
That's okay.
Open source AI.
But this is extra confusing because the company OpenAI years ago made a decision to stop open sourcing their most powerful models. And that's because they realized that these could be extremely dangerous and damaging.
You always give the optimistic interpretation, like, and I'm always the no, it's not altruism, it's IP.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting. It could be both. It could be altruistic and convenient for the profit of the company, for sure.
The capped profit, yeah.
Yeah, the capped profit of the company, absolutely. Yeah. But so building on your point there. Yes, I think it should be more regulated. The funny thing was I started writing, a European Union diplomat here in the United States asked me, after I told them that I had some strong views about open source AI, they asked me to write down my views on this. And they said, just give me 2 pages about this. And I was like, okay, all right, I'll write it down. So I wrote 2 pages and I sent it to the EU. This circulated in the European Commission's offices in Brussels. I went to Brussels then. I talked to the people there who were negotiating the AI Act a couple months ago, also before the act was finalized. And I said, this needs to be more regulated. And right around when I started getting into this, I started reading the drafts of the EU AI Act. And it's confusing because they have this process in the EU called trilogue, where instead of the House and the Senate in the US needing to agree on something, the European Parliament, the Council of the European Union, and the Commission, the European Commission, the 3 parties have to get together and agree. And so there are multiple drafts put forth by different parties. One of these drafts had an exemption for open source. And so it said, open source AI that are released, AI systems released under open models have benefits to the order of billions of dollars to the European economy. It's really important for science, and therefore all of these regulations about general purpose AI should not apply to open source models. And that was the European Parliament version, recitals 12A, B, and C. And when I read that, I was like, oh my God, exempt. This is crazy. And then I kept reading. It's insane. And I kept reading. And then I got to Article 28B. And Article 28B said open source AI systems will be subject to the same rules. I was like, wait, what the hell? Okay, this is one document. And then I asked around it. Sure enough, everyone I asked, like, yeah, these 2 parts of the document are not consistent with each other. One is recitals, one is articles. I had to figure out what that means. Apparently articles take precedence over recitals. But
that's good.
Yeah, yes, exactly. That's good. But I decided I need to be really explicit about this. And that 2-pager evolved into a 5-pager, evolved into a 10-pager. I circulated it with the White House, shared it with people in the US Congress. And then I eventually published it a couple weeks ago on Tech Policy Press. And as I was writing and thinking about how, open source should be subject to more regulations, just like what you said, I realized pretty much good enough if open source AI systems are just not exempted from the right set of rules for general purpose AI systems, because it's much, much harder for the open source ones to comply with them. Because the open source ones, as soon as they're released, there are people out there who take away all their safety features. Because they're open source, they can be modified. And so it's really hard to build open source systems that have to go through a risk assessment and say with a straight face, this doesn't pose any risks.
Yeah. So where does that land us then? I mean, it seems like clear that we need regulations for open source AI, but it just seems like the coin's up in the air. We don't know how it's going to land.
I mean, it's a weird moment right now. We're in this strange in-between space where I think the people on both sides of this debate are declaring victory and declaring defeat. It's very strange. And part of that is because until a couple days ago, everything we had on this information from the EU was kind of spoken comments at press conferences, and it wasn't super, super clear or written down. But now it's been written down. It's very clear that any open source model above 10 to the 25th of compute required to train it, or that is deemed to pose a high risk by the AI office in consultation with experts, will be subject to the same rules as any general purpose AI system. And to me, that's an enormous victory. And that's because we have open source models that are already out there in the wild, and it's going to be impossible to get those back. Those are never coming back. They'll be circulating on BitTorrent forever if all of a sudden, they're not coming back.
Well, thank you so much for doing this, and maybe we'll chat again once the act actually passes and we see what it actually looks like.
Sounds good. No, it was a pleasure. Great questions, and glad we saw eye to eye on that last thing there.
I mean, I think we see eye to eye on a lot, but I wanted to push back and see what you had to say for a lot of the stuff. Thanks so much.
Thank you.